With so much on the line for our democracy, let's bring in the Nevada Secretary of State, Cisco Aguilar. Vaughn Hilliard is MS Now's senior White House reporter. Paul Butler is a Georgetown University law professor. And Max Rose is a former Democratic congressman from New York and a senior advisor for Vote Vets. Paul, I was in the makeup room when this ruling came down. I gasped. Your take on what the court decided today?
I gasped too, which is unfortunate because it's a common sense decision.
Sure.
What the court said is that when you vote on the day that you cast your ballot. The Trump administration was arguing you don't really vote until the vote gets counted. And the law in Mississippi allowed votes to get counted 5 days after Election Day, as long as they were postmarked by Election Day. What the court said today, 5-4 decision, is that the postmark is what's important.
Secretary Aguilar, we are all watching this and wondering what it means for democracy. The stakes are slightly different for you because if this ruling had come down a different way, it would potentially change the way in which you administer your own elections in your state. Tell us what is at stake with this ruling, the relief I imagine you were feeling today.
Well, today, the voters won, not individual Secretary of States, not elections officials, but the voters, because we continue to have our elections as we intended to have our elections. It's about Nevadans deciding for Nevada what's in the best interest of our voters. And the fact that we get to run our elections like we did in 24, we get to run them like we did recently in the 26 primary, the voters can remain confident that our elections work and that we're going to continue to make them safe, secure, and accessible throughout the entire state.
Max, there was an interesting line in the majority opinion today. It reads, "This is not a case about the Constitution. We do not consider the scope of Congress's authority to regulate federal elections." Given the alacrity with which the President of the United States pivoted to making this legislative, what do you make of that part of the ruling?
I'm sure Donald Trump was poring over the ruling for the last several hours before issuing his tweets. Look, when you think about what Donald Trump is doing right now, when you juxtapose it with the fact that you have multiple Republican senators saying this is dead on arrival, begs the question, why keep on doing it? Why keep on calling for this? I think there's one simple answer at this point. That is, he wants to sow confusion, chaos, and distrust about the upcoming midterm elections. We've seen this show before. We all remember January 6th. This is not just words at this point. So in the face of the Supreme Court ruling, in the face of the continued calls for the SAVE Act, the question we all should be asking right now is what are the Democrats going to do about it? Particularly, what are the Democratic governors going to do about it who have a consolidated, concentrated number of swing congressional seats within their states? Virginia, New Jersey, New York, Michigan, California. These are where the action is. What are those governors going to do to stand up to Trump-related electoral interference?
Okay, I'm going to come back to the question that you posed about governors, because before I do, Vaughn, I want you to answer the question that Max Rose just posed, perhaps rhetorical, about why the president continues to come back to this push for a piece of legislation his own caucus is telling him is DOA.
And the reality for Donald Trump here, 4 months out from the midterm elections, Alicia, is that he and his executive branch have effectively now, by the courts, been backed into a corner, not by the courts, but also by Congress, being unwilling to pass the SAVE Act. And that calls into question what their next line of action is. Because last year, the president, last August, he threatened to sign an executive order that would effectively limit all mail-in voting. That executive order never came. But there were two other executive orders that would have impacted election procedures that he did sign, and a federal judge struck both of those down, making clear that Article 1 of the Constitution puts the rights of handling elections to state and local jurisdictions, and that as Democrats, back when Joe Biden and Democrats took control of the House and Senate back in 2021, found out were their two pieces of federal election voting legislation that they tried to push through and unsuccessfully were unable to pass, found out is that you kind of need Congress in order to make any changes at the Washington, D.C. national level here. And so really, where does the White House turn from here? It's a question. The president could sign an executive order. The courts could come back in and nullify it. Or potentially that is where you hear some of the concerns from Bill Pulte, the director of national intelligence, Kash Patel, the FBI. Could one of these federal agencies try to directly interfere with the election procedures? Because for the president's own ability through the signature and through the White House to make that sort of election changes at this point continues to really get hamstrung.
Secretary Aguilar, let's talk a little bit about what we're hearing from Senate Republicans, because you have a lot of folks who are saying it's not where our priority should be, the timeline doesn't work. But then you also have Kansas Republican Senator Roger Marshall on Meet the Press really struggling to answer questions about the Save America Act. Let's take a listen.
Just give me one example of where there was some level of fraud that the Save America Act would have prevented that would have altered an election.
Yeah, Ryan, I guess we just look at this differently. I think, again, I'm going back to that an election process needs to be trustworthy, that the election process is important to the backbone and the survival of this nation. So what are Democrats running from? Why are they afraid? If what you're saying is true, then why are you worried about this? Why not have voter ID?
One reason, Secretary, he just asked for one example, and the senator could not find a single example because they have a solution in search of a problem that does not exist. And they keep on harping on voter ID because they know voter ID is the only piece of this that is widely popular. But this is not a voter ID piece of legislation alone.
No, I can tell you Nevada runs some of the safest, most secure and accessible elections in the country. And my fellow Democratic Secretary of States are doing the same. I do want to answer one question, though, asking what governors can do. I think it's important to understand what secretaries are already doing. Today was a third win for secretaries of state across this country. Our first win last week was on the first executive order. Our second win the very next day was on the second executive order. We are testing the power of the federal government to interfere and intimidate elections officials at the state and local level. These are big wins for all of us. We're going to continue to hold the president accountable for the fact that states run our elections, not the federal government.
We keep asking Paul Butler, who's going to sort of be the final line of defense here, right? I mean, the question is currently before the U.S. Senate. They seem to be pretty clear on where they are. The question this morning was before the Supreme Court. If they continue all of this funny business, what role are the courts supposed to play?
The courts will play the role of interpreting the Constitution, which gives the main power to regulate elections to states. They can regulate the elections in their jurisdictions. Congress also has certain powers. The president doesn't have any power over elections. And the Supreme Court essentially blessed that constitutional principle today. The Trump administration was against the Mississippi mail-in voting law because they were perpetrating the big lie that the 2020 election was stolen, that there's a problem with election integrity in the United States. There is not a problem with election integrity. Again, that was the purpose of the Trump administration's opposition to mail-in voting. Mind you, mail-in voting is used by U.S. troops who are stationed overseas. It's used by senior citizens. It's even used by Donald Trump. And today, at least 5 Supreme Court justices said that they're not going to accept Trump's lies that the election was stolen and that there's a problem with election integrity. So that's a good sign for the future of democracy.
So it's playing out in the courts, it's playing out in legislative bodies, and then Secretary Aguilar, it's playing out in our politics and in our election. Your opponent this year has a history of spreading conspiracy theories about voter fraud. I wonder sort of how much more complex it is to message to voters that they ought to be voting when you're running against someone who says, don't believe this election in the first place.
Well, look, it's scary. We know that the road to the White House runs through Nevada. And 26 is about electing strong Secretary of States who are going to stand up for the rule of law during the 2028 election. We need to elect a president who understands this country, wants to hear about the issues, and not worried about the overall election system. If we do not elect strong Democratic Secretaries of State, we're going to see some real challenges in 28. So, yes, I do have an opponent who is an election denier. I ran against him once already. But these are interesting times. When he has the force of the president behind him, we need to come together as Democrats and make sure we are supporting Democratic secretaries across the state. We need resources, we need support, but we also need the support to know that everybody has our back, and we're going to continue to push forward so that every voter across this country has a voice and they can exercise their fundamental right to vote.
Vaughn Hilliard, the rulings today from the Supreme Court, sort of a mixed bag for this White House. What are you hearing from them about how they are metabolizing the decisions that came down today from the Supreme Court?
Ultimately, this is going to be a big indicator for them, and tomorrow as well, the remaining decisions, the extent to which the president can unilaterally move forward with additional moves in the last 2.5 years of his presidency. That is what this White House has been waiting for here this June of 2026, really giving them a nod to the extent that they can make decisions pertaining to independent federal agencies moving forward. Clearly, the Federal Reserve decision was pushed them back some, and clearly, despite Jay Powell's replacement being confirmed, an understanding is that there is some still independence for the Federal Reserve here. But by and large, for the White House, I think tomorrow, between the ruling as it pertains to transgender individuals in sports, as well as the birthright citizenship question, is going to be a massive decision to the extent that the President of the United States makes further decisions moving forward, and understanding the extent to which these justices make clear in their writings whether they believe the president can move forward with other initiatives and bypass Congress or even other prior courts in either prior decisions that have been made over the quarter of the last more than century even.